All right, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today as we do our online land management program for 2020, entering 2021. My name is Jim Jansen. Today we'll have three other presenters along with myself joining us today. The name of our program is Effective Budgeting, Negotiation, and Management Strategies for Agricultural Land. If you registered for this meeting today and provided an address, we will be sending a paper handout as well as an evaluation out to everyone that did register with an address in an effort to better divulge the information we're supposed to be discussing today. And we apologize we can't do it in person, but with COVID, it works best to be doing it online. Also, you'll note on the first slide here in our handouts, and you should have also received an email, the handouts are available at farm.unl.edu/LTCR21. And once again, if you would like a paper copy of the handout, you can email anyone on the land management team or myself, and we'll make sure that you get on the mailing list to get a copy of the paper handout. Questions today can be entered in the chat box. We'll be trying to monitor those, and at the end of each presenter section, we will be providing a brief period of time. I also encourage you to engage via email or phone with the presenters today to get your answers to your many questions you may have. This presentation today is sponsored. The grant that provided the funding for this grant project is through the North Central Extension Risk Management Education Center. Also the USDA and Nebraska Extension has always been a partner in these projects. So my name is Jim Jansen. My best way to get a hold of me is either via email or phone number. The phone number is my direct line there that you can text me on or anything. And if you didn't get the handouts today, just send me an email and we'll make sure you get a copy of them. So once again, the first presentation today will be on land values and cash rents and matters related to lease arrangements in Nebraska. First part, the Nebraska Farm Real Estate Survey and Report was started back in 1978 by Drs. Ron Hansen and Bruce Johnson. Their survey surveys individuals including professional farm and ranch managers, agricultural appraisers, in addition to agricultural bankers. 2 times each year we do 2 different things. Preliminary estimates are published typically the second Wednesday in March. That will give you a detailed outline of where preliminary estimates are on land values and cash rents. And the final report is published in the following June. The final report has additional detail beyond things related to land values and cash rents. Things such as what percent of land in Nebraska is public, or what percent of land in Nebraska is purchased by farmers or outside investors, things of that nature. The website you can find all updates is agecon.unl.edu/real estate. And if you don't do the computer thing and you know where your local county extension office is, be sure to stop by. Most office managers like to run off a copy of the real estate proceedings related to either land values or cash rents. And with that being said, you're more than welcome to access materials that way. A little bit about how we divide the state of Nebraska up. There are 93 counties inside the state of Nebraska, and with those 93 counties, we divide the state into 8 different regions. These 8 regions share what we call similar production attributes: expectations for rainfall, yields, soil type, growing season, length of growing season. And with that being said, these regions share similarities. These similarities tend to lead to similar cash rents. And with that being said, the information that the University of Nebraska-Lincoln summarizes is by a regional basis. We'll start at more of a regional level in the presentation. Due to the duration of our presentation today, we cut down a little bit on the land value side of it. We're going to focus more on cash rents. But we start at the much larger area being the region, step down to the county, and then down to the farm. And some of these maps I'll be showing today, you may want to see them in greater detail. And you can, once again, you can find all handouts in addition to the county level cash rent estimates via the website link that was sent to you, or by sending anyone on our land management team an email, and we'll be sure to get you a paper copy sent out. Briefly on land values, and this is a slide, I'm only going to present on one slide specifically on regionalized land values. There are 8 different types of land in our farm real estate report that we follow. These include irrigated and dryland cropland, in addition to grazing land. Grazing land can be tillable or non-tillable, as well as hayland. From these 8 different types of land, each year we estimate the average value of land as of February 1st of the current year compared to February 1st of the prior year. With that being said, we estimated in the state of Nebraska, if you took into account all of the different types of land, the estimated value of land per acre was about $2,725 an acre. That's roughly 3% higher than the prior year. Western parts of the state, including the northwest and the southwest, were down just slightly. Other areas of the state were slightly higher. So it kind of depends where you're at in terms of where the land values are headed. And if you get a copy of our handout, you can scroll through those and take a look at a little bit more detail on the regionalized land values for something like gravity irrigated cropland or whatever it might be. Many folks ask me where land values headed. Well, when I talk related to the land values, there are really 2 things that influence it. One of those things being the average value of land relates to the value of what we're producing, and also interest rates. Related to the average value of what we're producing, the number 1 crop in the state of Nebraska, in addition to other crops as soybeans or wheat, is graphed here on this chart. The average value of corn since 1978 is presented as a red line. And as you notice, it veers up sharply starting in about 2012, 13, 14, and has since come down. And then the blue line is the all-land ag land value, the price of land in Nebraska. And we noticed that also veered up and then it came down and then it just kicked up just slightly for 2020. And on the right-hand side, you'll notice there's a couple different lines on there. And those lines, the official price I used when we did this report was the May price that the small arrow is pointing to. But you'll also notice that we have different price estimates. And what I'm trying to emphasize there is depending upon the time of the year, especially when we're in a financial situation like we are right now with uncertainty related to COVID or whatever the matter might be, we see that the average value of corn has changed significantly. And that being said, we'll probably see an impact on the farm real estate. Now, we're not at price levels that we were, say, 3, 4, 5 years ago, but hopefully we're in a better position than we were, say, last March with a little bit higher grain price. The big point of this presentation today, and the point of Austin Duerfeldt and Allan Vyhnalek's presentation, is trying to span the difference between where land values versus cash rents are with respect to input expenses, what is equitable given what's being produced, things of that nature. The other thing, and I think this is probably one of the biggest factors influencing why land values are as stable as they are, if not growing, based on some of the recent sale activity that people that I have interacted with have responded to us, are interest rates. Interest rates are at the lowest point in recent history since the inception of this report. Land, farm real estate loans, house loans, you can get a 30-year mortgage for whatever, 3 to 3.5%. Farm real estate loans might be a little bit higher than that, but the point is we're not paying 8.5 or 10.5. We're paying probably half or even a third of that amount. When you figure out interest rates into the real estate value of something, lower interest rates tend to lead to higher values. And that's what we've seen in housing, vehicles, whatever the cases might be. Something to point out, and I know this is a little bit controversial, and you can find this actual article here. It came from the Lincoln Journal-Star. But the Nebraska legislature had a late session last year because of COVID-19. One package that they did get passed was a form of property tax relief. Property tax relief is the initial year, it's going to be about $125 million for the state of Nebraska, with working up to a higher side of closer to $375 million is what they're projecting by 2025. What this is it is a state, not a federal, but a state income tax credit. And what the state income tax credit When you, as a landowner in Nebraska, filing a state of Nebraska income tax return, you will have the ability to file a small and receive a small degree of relief from your property taxes through this. That's what the legislative package was. Now, where did the funding for this come from? At the time this legislation was passed, we did not have casino gambling at horse racetrack facilities legalized. It was a ballot position or proposition on the ballot that the citizens of Nebraska voted on, which I know there's many people have various views on it. But the funding, a large percent of the taxation revenue from casino gambling would go towards the property tax relief. And just not for agricultural land, but also residential properties in the state as well. There's some additional detail on the bottom of this slide. Just know there's going to be a small degree of property tax relief coming for landowners in Nebraska. And where did this funding come from? Well, the three initiatives that were on the ballot about a month ago, or a little bit more than a month ago, related to legalization of gambling at horse racetrack facilities, a commission to regulate that, and then also earmarking, and I highlighted on this slide, but where do the proceeds of the taxation revenue go? And you can see on the second point on what the outcome of the election was, that it appeared at that time, and it basically about 2/3 majority, not quite, but about 65 or 68%, depending upon the initiative, approved of gambling in the state. Dave Aiken, our ag law specialist in the Department of Agricultural Economics here at the University of Nebraska, wrote a really good Cornhusker on this topic. I noted the date and the source of it. Be sure to take a look at it if you have additional interest on it. All right, if you're following along in your electronic handouts, or you'll notice we skipped a lot of slides here. And I'm doing that for the sake, we have done this presentation once online, and the feedback that we were receiving was people like about a 2 to 2 hour and 15-minute presentation. Traditionally, our regular land management meeting is about 3 hours, and that's why we wanted to kind of boil it down. On the topics of land values, where are things headed? The one thing we can say is the economic factors that are influencing farm real estate are presented on this slide. This is a set of questions we ask each and every year. Where do we anticipate land values to be headed in the future? If the line is on the left-hand side, we expect the land values to be declining. If the line is on the right-hand side, we expect them to be increasing. What are the negative forces, the things that are leading to a decline in farm real estate? The outlook on property taxes, as well as crop and input expenses associated with crops, were quite negative. On the positive side, things like interest rates, federal farm program payment assistance, they were noted as slightly positive. 1031 exchange. Allan might mention that in his presentation. It relates to the topic of transitioning land. It works quite well as a mechanism to move land between individuals in the event you inherit something but you'd like to own land somewhere else. This chart about 5 years ago was extremely positive, and it's very interesting to look at this over time because the factors, the economic forces on the left-hand side of the chart stay the same, but our intent to see land values increasing, which are on the right-hand side, or declining on the left-hand side, fluctuate quite a bit from year to year. All right. So that wraps up our portion on land values. The big things to note, there's some small degree of property tax relief coming. The mechanism that's going to be partially funding some of that relief comes from the legalization of gambling at horse racetrack facilities across the state of Nebraska. We look forward to 2021 in terms of land values. It might be a little bit more bullish than we were this past spring. Now, focusing on cash rents, we're going to transition here into this. And talking about cash rents, we're going to start at a regional basis and work our way down to the farm. Glennis McClure is going to talk a little bit when we're down on the farm about cash rents, talking about production expenses. This morning, you're just going to get a brief overview of the budgeting tools we have available here at the University of Nebraska, but she'll be taking a much deeper look this afternoon at it. So be sure to tune in if you're registered for it. So at the regional level in 2020, and I know everybody wants to know where 2021 cash rents are headed, sometimes you have to step back and look where were 2020 cash rents. So Dryland cropland rental rates vary quite a bit across the state of Nebraska. From northwest Nebraska, we're at 28 an acre, to the eastern part of the state, we're closer to 215 an acre, or 220 an acre. They fluctuate based upon the rainfall, productivity of the soil, things of that nature. We notice, overall in the state of Nebraska, they were up slightly, but when you see a very small percent increase or a very small percent decline, is that really a big change, or is that more indicative that the cash rents at this time when the real estate survey was conducted were fairly steady? That might be a better way to kind of analyze it or think about it. Cash rental rates, in addition to the average for the region, we have an average of the upper third of cash rents, an average of the lower third of cash rents, and an average of all the responses. And that's what stood for in the bottom left-hand corner, right below the panhandle of Nebraska there. We see the average of the high grade or average of the high third, average of the low grade or average of the low third, and then an average of all the responses. These averages reflect the differences in cash rents around the different regions of the state. They reflect some of the matters I've mentioned, but once again, where do you sit at in this average relative to 2020 when you're headed into 2021? If you're on the upper end of cash rents in 2020, I don't know if you'd expect to see a large increase for 2021. Now, if you're on the lower or the lowest end of these cash rents, your expectations might be a little bit different in terms of what you're having to pay or what you might be receiving. So think about this with a grain of salt. Everything's an average, and there's a lot more to an average just than what is inside of it. All right, another source of cash rental rate information that comes from outside the University of Nebraska comes from the National Agricultural Statistics Service, or NASS. NASS has a division right here in Lincoln. It covers Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota. As part of their survey, the survey is done typically in odd-numbered years, and on occasion they do it also in even-numbered years. But with the survey that was conducted this year, we can produce the results here in a slide, and this is also posted on our website, or if you go to this specific link right here, you can take a closer look at the county estimates for different things like how many head of cattle are present in a certain county in Nebraska, or what's average corn yield. And from their survey, we see here, we have a breakout of the state of Nebraska. Now you're going to notice a few things on here. Certain counties are in white, and if they're in white, there's either not a lot of dryland cropland, which out in the sand hills, you typically don't see a lot of dryland cropland. You'd probably see more likely hayland, sub-irrigated meadows, something of that nature. And also, if you don't have enough counties responding, York County might be a county where there is some dryland cropland, but if there wasn't enough actual agricultural producers to respond, they may not get a response. Once again, we see somewhat similar trends to what the University of Nebraska does. We see county level estimates in the panhandle. They're in the $20 to $30 range, and working our way into the eastern part of Nebraska, we can see anything from the around $150 all the way up to the low 200s. So it greatly fluctuates depending on where you're at in the state. On the topic of irrigated cash rents, once again, we're going to start at the region, work our way to the county. We'll also talk about grazing land cash rents, and then I'll provide some ideas on how do we set farm level cash rents. So starting with center pivot irrigated cash rents, a couple things to note. These cash rents assume that the landlord owns the entire irrigation system. That would include the pivot, the pump, and the power unit. If the landlord does not own one of those things, you would adjust the cash rental rate down to account for the tenant providing those features. In our traditional handouts that we'll be sending out if you give us your address or post it online, we wrote an article a couple of years ago. It was a Cornhusker Economics article. And inside of this article, we took a little bit deeper look at that topic. So be sure to check it out if you're in a case like that where you'd like to find some additional information. Now, in addition to the average rate, we have an average of the high third, average of the low third, and an average of all the responses. Now this breakdown gives us a pretty good feel on how cash rental rates vary. What influences cash rents? Things like the quality of the water, Do you have a well, an irrigation source that's quite steady, or do you have a source that, certain times of the year you might get cut off, or the quality of the water in terms of the flow rate might come low if it's a very dry year? Those things all influence the cash rent. Also, if you have an operator on that parcel of ground, what degree of improvements are they providing to the ground? When we talk about an improvement, if they are providing their time, we don't pay someone $10 an hour to go work on a pivot. Having a professional irrigation company come out, there's usually a fairly good service fee plus so many hundreds an hour after that. So if you talk about what is an equitable cash rent, you want to be sure to take into account when a tenant provides some of those services. The irrigated rental rates across Nebraska, this is a breakdown here. Now I know there are certain counties like Holt County, for example, where there clearly is irrigated cropland. Once again, if you get a survey, if you're an operator or a landlord, be sure to make it out. This information can impact us in terms of being able to find additional information across the state. The other thing to note on the irrigated rental rates that NAS provides, those rates do not take into account, they do not separate out center pivot from gravity irrigated. For example, in Scottsbluff County, where there's irrigation, a fair amount of that is gravity or flood irrigation. If it's gravity or flood irrigation, that might rent for a lower rate than what center pivot irrigation rental rates do. If that's the case, they created kind of a weighted average to say if half the ground in Scottsbluff County is center pivot and the other half is flood irrigated, the rate that they report out there would reflect that. That's why we see quite a difference in the rates reported across Nebraska. And I'm sure if you're probably well aware if you're in an area where there still is a fair degree of flood or gravity irrigation. All right, moving over onto the topic of grazing land rental rates. There are two different ways we can rent properties here in Nebraska. One rate can be by the acre, the other rate can be by the cow-calf pair. And by the pasture or the cow-calf pair rental rates, at the bottom, the bottom line of what is on the lease is what is going to be paid. And there's different ways to figure this out, and we have some resources to help us figure these things. The University of Nebraska does report a per acre rate. It will be in your handouts. And in addition, NAS, the National Agricultural Statistics Service, also reports the average county rental rate. Now the NAS rate, as you can see, they fluctuate widely across the state. Why is that? Quality of the grass, type of soil that's being grazed, the stocking rate, how many animal units can be put on an area. An example, Sioux County, Nebraska reports an acre of, or per acre average of $10 an acre versus Wayne County, Nebraska is closer to $80 an acre. Obviously in Wayne County, maybe it only takes 2 or 3 acres versus Sioux County, you might be closer to 15 or maybe even more than that depending on where you're at. And also local supply and demand forces. If you're in a ranching area where there isn't nearly as many people versus the eastern part of the state where you might have a mix of operations of row crop in addition to livestock operations, things can fluctuate due to some of those reasons. The average monthly rental rate for one cow-calf pair in 2020, so one cow, one calf for 1 month during the summer grazing season, the rates fluctuate around somewhere from the high 40s to the low 60s. And let's just pick on the Eastern District in this example. It's $51.35 an acre. Well, let's just say the monthly average was $50 a pair. And I'm sorry, the Eastern District, I need to correct that. That should be per pair, not per acre, as well as some of those others. I'll have to take a look at cleaning that up a little bit. The average cow-calf pair rental rates on this slide are per month. And when they are per month, or excuse me, when they're per pair, the per pair, you would times it by 5 if you have a monthly grazing rate for a period of 5 months. In addition to the pair rates, we also have the average for the upper third and average of the lower third. Now these rates reflect a lot of different things. What influences cow-calf pair grazing rates? Quality of the pasture is one thing, local supply and demand. Availability of water. If you have an electrical hookup, who's paying for that bill? Fencing, and as well as control of noxious weeds or brush. Depending on who answers those questions, they could possibly influence some of these rates that are reported here. We've stepped through a large regional average down to a county, and now we need to step down to the farm. And when we step down to the farm, there are different ways to estimate cash rents. I'm going to present a couple different topics here on how do we estimate cash rents. First idea that we have here is adjusting cash rents from a regional estimate. We might be able to identify through some resource that the average cash rent for a county is, let's say, $135 per acre. We might also know the average corn yield is, say, 120 bushel per acre. If you take the county rental rate divided by the average yield, you get what is called the average county rent per bushel. If you take the average county rent per bushel and times it by the APH, the actual production history, that's a 10-year average associated with that parcel of ground with respect to crop insurance. If you take the average county rent per bushel times the average yield, we take the county level rental rate and we adjust it down to the farm level. We take what we know, the average county rental rate per bushel, and times it by the average yield. And then we end up with the farm level cash rent. Another idea when it comes to setting cash rent is called cash equivalent from crop share. Basic idea behind it. We have many landowners report to us that they like the idea of a crop share. One of the challenges faced by a crop share is who pays for some of these different expenses and who markets the grain. Crop shares are equitable because in a good year, the landlord gets whatever share they get, and in a tight year, they get whatever share they get. So they get rewarded in a good year, and maybe not quite as much in a tighter year. Yields are down. But with a crop share, some of those challenges I mentioned, we have to think about, instead of doing a crop share, how could we do cash equivalent? How could we set a cash rent from that crop share? Well, the cash rent would probably be what a landlord might expect to receive if they were on crop share, right? What do you anticipate you would make? What's the net return to the owner? So we have three different scenarios set up here. One's from March, one is from July, and one is from November. And from these three different scenarios, we see a breakout of the average per bushel, the average yield for this particular ground was 160 bushel. The landlord gets half, the operator gets half. So they get 80 bushel per acre. They also pay half of the production expenses, seed, fertilizer, chemicals. It's one of the reasons we have Glennis McClure talking about crop budgeting this afternoon in addition to the other budgets. But the one thing we did let vary across all these slides is the average price per bushel. And the prices I picked here kind of gives you a scenario. Midsummer, prices didn't look nearly as good as they did this past spring. And then in November, things were a lot better than they were this past summer. And what a landlord might anticipate they could make per acre probably relates to the value of that price. So that's reflected across this, generally speaking. It just goes to show us when we talk about setting cash rents, we're trying to pick what would be considered an equitable cash rent. We need to pick one that reflects some of these different prices and some of these different matters across time. The third idea is from cash equivalent from hay share. Sometimes folks have a parcel of ground in which there might be a case where it's odd shaped, you're uncertain on exactly what it's going to yield. So we got two different scenarios here. We have a 1/3, 2/3 hay split where the landlord takes a third of the crop, the tenant takes the other 2/3, and we have a 50-50 split. Landlord gets half the crop, tenant gets half the crop. Under the 50-50 split, let's say you might put out maybe $20 an acre in nitrogen. If you're putting out $20 an acre in nitrogen, the landlord under this made-up scenario is paying half of the fertilizer expense. And under these two scenarios here, they take, if the property yielded 2.5 tons per acre, under the one case, they would get about 2/3 of a ton, and then under the other case, they would get about 1.5 tons. So that's how we see these things split out like this and get reflected accordingly. And how do we set this up? Well, you'd ask yourself, even if the landlord doesn't want a share of the hay, what would the land tenant be willing to pay for the landlord's share of the hay? That's kind of what the motivation of what we have provided here is. With respect to return on investment, every asset is an investment, and it'll have a return. Whether that return is positive or negative, well, that's another thing. But right now on agricultural land, it tends to be a rate of return that's fairly low, typically well under 3%, closer to say 1.5 to maybe 2% on grazing land. Dryland cropland is closer to around 2%, 2 to 2.5, and irrigated might be a little bit closer to 2.5 to maybe 2 3/4. If you're really interested in these numbers, take a look at Table 5 of the Nebraska Farm Real Estate Report, and you can see the breakdown there. If you take the value of the land investment times the rate of return, you end up with the rental rate per acre. All right, so we'll see here, stepping through, and there's actually a supplemental Cornhusker economics that was wrote on this topic related to that who's responsible for maintaining the irrigation system, and this is kind of trying to pull everything together. Well, we asked the question, who is responsible for maintaining an irrigation system? The breakdown we had was about half of the time it's the landlord and the tenant. Tenant might take care of basic things like fixing a flat tire. The landlord takes care of some of the larger things. A third of the time the tenant just takes care of it. And the remainder of the time the landlord takes care of it, or maybe the landlord hires someone to take care of it. If you have a situation where the tenant owns a pivot, but they're renting a parcel of ground that is an irrigated parcel, but the landlord does not own it, how much should you take off to account for the land tenant owning the pivot? Well, you'd probably want to take off what does it cost to operate that pivot in terms of upkeep, depreciation, and also insurance. Insurance on irrigation equipment is not cheap. About 2/3 of the time you would take off somewhere between $26 to $50 an acre, and about a third of the time the discount, how much you'd take off the cash rent, would be around 10 to 25 an acre. I would say based on phone calls we have coming in, 20 to 30 is a fairly common number. And then about 10% of the time, or a little less than 10%, it's somewhere closer to $50 or more. And when we say $50 or more, that really relates to the fact that you have a situation where you might have, say for example, a precision application of water, or maybe a system that has a swing out end on it, so you can cover, 155 acres or whatever the number might be. So we have a table here that provides a breakout of a case where if the tenant does not own, if the landlord does not own the power unit, but the tenant does. Major types of way that we pump water here could be a diesel engine, propane or natural gas, or even an electric motor. The discount per acre are in these columns across this table here. It's $0, 1 to 9, 10 to 20, or $20 plus. And with this breakout, what we see is, about 2/3 of the time you usually take off somewhere between 1 to 9 or 10 to 20. I would say based on phone calls that we take in, it's fairly common if the tenant provides a power unit to take a discount of somewhere between $10 to $15 an acre off on the cash rent. And once again, there's a supplemental publication. Be sure to take a look at it. It's a Cornhusker Economics, I believe, from 2018. And try to wrap all this together now. On the topic of leases, back when we wrote this grant back in 2019, it wasn't nearly as dry as it is right now for certain parts of the state. We're talking much more about flooding. Accounting for flooding when it comes to a lease arrangement. How do you account for the risk associated with flooding in a lease? We asked the first question, did your 2019 lease have any provisions in the lease to account for flooding, from damages for flooding? Overwhelmingly, about 3/4 of the responses, we did not receive any good indication of, and really account for that. About 15% of the leases, there was some kind of a partial adjustment, some kind of mechanism inside of the lease to account for that. And only about 5% really truly did account for flooding. We asked also the question on this matter related to lease arrangements. Did you make any adjustments to the cash rent? About 1/3 of the time there was no adjustment made. A little over 1/3 of the time there was a reduced rent payment made. And the remaining of the time either there was no rent or there was some other situation set up. So this is important to note. If you had a parcel of ground that suffered from extensive prevent plant on it, how was the cash rent handled? Either it was reduced rent or no adjustment made. And if it was no rent or some other deal that happened and it was prevent plant, that'd be a case where there probably would be no prevent plant money paid from crop insurance because they probably would have abandoned the property at that point. So the main thing is we want to set up an equitable situation to account for cases when there's a lot of uncertainty going on. Moving forward into 2020, were there any adjustments made to the lease to account for flooding or disaster? Still, half of the leases didn't have a big adjustment made, but at least 1/3 of them had some kind of a partial adjustment, and a little more than 10% did have an adjustment made. The thing is, try to put in your lease whatever best situates you for risk, whether drought, flooding, price volatility. Take into account the very greatest concern an operator might face related to your particular property. If you do not have your lease in writing, I would highly encourage you to get one in writing. Free resource to get your leases in writing is aglease101.org, aglease101.org. On aglease101.org, you can find a free fill-in-the-form PDF lease. It's open to anyone in the public, and with that resource, free to download, great place to put your lease in writing. And Allan Vyhnalek will talk a little bit about if you do not have your lease in writing, what does that mean? And that's what we'll handle right there. Okay, and the final piece that we have here, if you do like taking these meetings in online, I know our in-person meetings here in Lincoln typically attract a crowd of around 100 people, especially if we have a lunch to go with it. But COVID, hopefully things get better by next summer. But if you do like some of these things you're seeing today, the website is agecon.unl.edu/land management. And each business quarter throughout the year, we have 4 presentations. Our first one's scheduled to be presented on February 15th, 2020. We do it over the lunch hour. Had pretty positive feedback to having these meetings over lunch instead of in the evening. And we're going to be talking about how do you set cash rents, kind of this tail end of what I was talking on, a little bit more on 2021 cash rents. And Allan will be talking about a little bit on lease arrangements, some things we need to take from there. And once again, if you want to submit any questions to get answered live, we don't get a ton of them, but we try to boil all the questions down into certain topics and answer those as we can. So with that being said, if you'd like to reach out to me, my contact information is provided here. I'll check in with some of our hosts today. If we had any questions come in that need to get addressed, I'll try to address those. And Glennis will briefly start. Did we have anything?
Nope.
All right, no questions. So what we'll do is we'll have Glennis get started talking briefly on budgets. We're going to take about a 5 to 10 minute break at, say, around 10 o'clock, and then we'll have Austin and Allan get started after that. So with that being said, we thank you for joining us, and be sure to stay on as we get Glennis started here in just a minute.
All right. So I'm Glennis McClure. I'm an extension educator and farm and ranch management analyst in the Department of Ag Economics. My office is on campus. Of course, we've been away from campus quite a bit, but I know this afternoon I'm going to head back over there and present to you information about the new Ag Budget Calculator. So I know some of you have registered for that, and I'm excited to be able to walk through that new program with you and talk about how we determine cost of production using that. I want to thank the team. Jim, thank you I always learn something when I listen to what you have to say. And Allan and also Austin, who are on the program. Thank you for having me included with talking about cost production. And I also want to thank Jim, Weiss, and Karen Wedding for being our host today here in Lancaster County. So, all right, so let's go ahead and go through a brief summary or overview of enterprise budgets. We're only going to take about 10 minutes or so. We'll see how that goes. All right, so I wanted to mention to you that I do work with the crop budgets, and we did publish just within this last month, the 2021 crop budgets are online. And most of this information, along with the livestock budgets that I work with and the custom rates report that was published in 2020, it can be found at farm.unl.edu. So there's just a wealth of resources there. So that's kind of a go-to place if you're looking for supplemental information. All right, so why should we be interested in cost of production? I know many of you, of course, are landowners. So why is that important to you? And we do get questions quite often from landowners that are renting out their ground. So really, what is the cost of production with my tenant? And how are they doing? Because again, as a landlord, you really want them to do pretty well, right? You want to get paid your cash rent. You want to take a share in what they're producing. You want them to be good producers and to have good information. So that's pretty important. On a crop share, just understanding that what they're doing with their production is good practices. They're using inputs that work best for them. And again, trying to keep their costs down are going to help them be profitable. So if they're profitable, they can pay you. So cost of production for the tenant especially, and if you're on crop share, you understand that what are the costs that you have into that product. And basically that helps provide an anchor or a guide for them to make some marketing decisions and some program decisions. We're always looking at government programs and what's happening with that. But if we know really truly what our costs are, we can make some decisions. Like right now, with the markets up, listening to some programs, some market specialists over the weekend, they're starting to price some of the 2021 crop, even some percentage perhaps. And so if you've got a pretty good handle on where your costs are potentially going to be for 2021, we never know because we don't know exactly about how that yield's going to turn out. But if you have a pretty good idea looking at your past performances and again what your risks are going forward, you can make some of those decisions starting even now. And so there's just a lot of good reasons. Also, I think understanding cost of production and understanding what we have is not just the fertilizer and chemical costs that we have, a seed cost, all of that. It's also taking into consideration what their machinery, what investments they have, that's kind of an important thing for folks to understand as part of their cost of production. Can they afford to buy that next piece of equipment? And what does that do to their cost of production if they do invest in something high-ticket item like that? So, all right, so the 2021 budgets included this year 83 budgets, including and representing 15 different crops. And we've done those dating way back into I think they started back in the 70s. And when Excel came along, we've done those in Excel, and they're again in that form for 2021. So you can look at all of those budgets and determine what's pretty similar to your cropping patterns. And you could download an Excel file and go in and make some modifications to that. And then we are now adding those 2021 budgets into our new Ag Budget Calculator. And again, for those interested, we'll be talking about that this afternoon. So again, this is a picture of just off the website that is on CropWatch. So CropWatch they're the first to post our budgets, and it's important that all the crop producers, of course, get to take a look at those. But we have those published in a PDF, which is a printable format, and then also Excel. And so again, as I mentioned, you can find one of the 83 budgets or several of those that really fit what you're doing with your production, and go in and download that for information. We really do these as a guide. So we understand that everyone's operation is unique, and so none of these are going to fit perfectly with anybody, but you could go in and make some changes to that Excel file and update those and take a look at how your costs might compare to what we're talking about. So again, I think we're really moving into a nice era where we'll be using a new online program, again called the Ag Budget Calculator, or ABC, and so we can even more closely customize what your cost of production is by using that system. I just did a few quick summaries for you just for information, and for the 2021 crop budgets, we had you can see dryland corn, irrigated corn, and what I did is I combined all the dryland corn budgets and showed that we're looking at about 150 bushel average yield, and then the cash cost per bushel would be $2.35, and economic $3.49. So what is the economic versus cash? So economic includes our depreciation for our equipment investment and also opportunity cost of land. All of our budgets are done with the perspective of being the landowner. So a tenant can go in and say, no, well, this is what I'm paying for my land if I'm doing cash rent. So we can make those changes in that budget and really look at what their costs are. And keep in mind, if you are a cash rent tenant, your cash costs are going to be higher. So the economic costs, or including the land opportunity costs, are higher in most of our cases, but that can be flipped if you are a cash rental tenant. So you can take a look at that. I've just provided that for you, and it is in your handouts. I know some of these charts get to be a little bit, small to take a look at, but you can see we go from $3.49 on dryland corn, $8.17 on dryland soybeans, and dryland wheat, which is more in the western part of the state. As far as our budgets go, you can see that we've got $3.22 there. So I included in the handouts for you just to look at specifically a couple of the budgets. And one is a dryland corn budget, and the other is an irrigated soybean budget. And those are both using, as Jim talked about, the values, the land values for the state. So I specifically just pulled those as sort of a statewide look. I think you can see on the budget that the soybean statewide budget, we're looking at like a 6,000 some acre value and $3,165 value for that dryland corn budget. So again, it's not representative just right here, it's representative of the whole state. And then I just wanted to show you again, and with our new budget calculator, we kind of went along this similar pattern in that we understand that people, producers, look at or know how to do their, they kind of think in terms of how do I produce this crop? So what are the operations? So we start with the operations. So if it's a no-till, there's probably a burn-down herbicide. We get the planting, more herbicides, some other insecticides perhaps. We've got the pivot costs, and of course harvesting and trucking costs as part of the field operations. And then you see along with those field operations, we show here what those material and service costs are. And then at the bottom section, you've got some interest costs. If you've got some carrying cost as far as borrowing some funds. And then you have down below, again, our opportunity cost of owning that ground and also the real estate taxes. So in this case, this is, again, that irrigated soybean budget. And so we've got $184 basically and $76 on real estate tax. So we're well over the $200, $250 mark as far as the cost of land in this case. So that is a larger proportion of the cost of production in this situation. Then I also thought it might be of interest to you to take a look at how things change from year to year. So I've got 4 years of data showing here where you can see how the fuel costs change. So we know that fuel really dipped down this year, and so we made that adjustment. Going all the way back to the highest point there was in 2019, we had $2.86, and it's gone all the way down to $1.73 for our fuel cost in our budget. That makes a difference when you're looking at cost of production with less fuel costs, of course. We have upped the labor cost because that's naturally what's happened over time. Some of our labor costs has gotten higher, as well as overhead. Overhead is those things like accounting, liability insurance, some of those factors have increased. So this year we made a $5 increase in the overhead costs into our budgets. Again, with oil prices dipping down, we are projecting, or at least our crop specialists that helped us with these budgets have projected that anhydrous somewhere around 27 cents per pounds of N. And then, some of our chemical costs, the glyphosate, also changed in price per gallon, based on our projections anyway. And then also seed costs. You can see that kind of the reverse has happened for seed costs. It was kind of hard to say exactly what we had. We've got obviously quite a list of seed prices, but we show a little bit of an uptick overall into the 2021 timeframe. So also I've mentioned, and it is pretty important that we understand what we've got for equipment values in our budgets, and we know that those costs have really not come down. So what we do every year is we take a look at what those list prices are, and that factors into information about depreciation, as well as repairs, fuel, all of those kinds of things that we need to operate our equipment. And so you can see the uptick there in the list prices that even for a medium tractor and a combine. So again, your tenants, your folks operating the ground, really do have, and have huge investments in some of their equipment just to be able to farm the ground. And then I've included for you, as I mentioned, we do utilize the land values from the Nebraska Real Estate Report. And so you can see again how we had dipped down from 2018, and we're back up a little bit for 2021 as far as what we put into the budgets for costs. Now I know this is really a busy chart, but I wanted to show you again some of our, sort of how the trends have worked over the last 4 years in relationship to the cost factors that have changed. How our cash cost per bushel, that would be those 4 first columns for the corn budgets, soybean budgets, wheat budgets, and obviously we do budgets for other crops as well. But these are sort of some of the main ones that we utilize here, at least corn and soybeans in the eastern part of the state. So I've got the cash cost showing. So in 2018, we had, for a Dryland, we had $2.85 as a cash cost, all the way up to $3.05 now. You can see an irrigated no-till from $1.67 to $1.99. So you can see how those change. And then the last 4 columns are the economic cost per bushel. And so again, you can see how that trend has worked. So again, that should be in your handout. And so you can take a look at, I just did a quick summary of certain budgets just to show some representation of how things have changed over this period of time. All right, I just want to mention again, we do the livestock budget, so if you have any interest in that, we do have those published. Again, this picture is not from Nebraska. It's one of my favorite pictures. Thankfully, a year ago, we did a lot of travel, and we had an opportunity to go to Switzerland. This is one of my favorite pictures from there, because I just love to see the cows on the mountains and the cows that had the bells and so on. So this has just been a favorite picture, and I just wanted to remind you with this that we do have cow-calf budgets that I've worked with, and if you have any questions about that, I'd be glad to field those questions. Just one slide or two here on the ag budget calculator. Again, we're going to talk about that more this afternoon. Folks can go in and create their own enterprise budget using this new system from scratch, or we can actually pull down one of our crop budgets and then go in and modify it quite easily. And so if you want more information right now, it's farm.unl.edu /ABC. So you could go into that website and take a look at information that I've posted there. I've provided an overview of the program, and also I do have some tutorials that I've produced so far. Now, we really are in phase 1 of that program, but it's really nice that we're to the point where it actually does a little bit more than our current budgets. We've got quite a ways yet to go with the development of that, but I'm really excited to be able to push that out and primarily have people testing. We're really sharing the link with those that are interested in testing the program so that we can receive feedback. As we're in the midst of development, we'd like to know what you think of the program and how we should change it and improve it even at this point. So again, we can create or customize our own budgets. Other things that we're going to be able to do with this is that overhead expense. You know, in our current budgets, it's really static, that $25 per acre, whereas we can really get down to the nitty-gritty on different operations and what their overhead expenses are. And so we'll have an opportunity within the ag budget calculator to do some reconciliation of that. We will be adding the livestock enterprise budgeting to it. We're looking at some features on whole farm reports as well as a cash flow in the end. So just think about it. If you take all of your enterprises, you have all of your costs, especially all your cash costs, included for all of your enterprises. In the end, if we can get a cash flow, we think that's going to be a really nice feature for folks to do. So just in conclusion here, I've done a lot of work with the farm stress topic. And I just wanted to share with you that I think it's important, you as oftentimes landowners, kind of paying attention to what's happening with the families that you're working with or that maybe your tenants, learning to understand that we all can be stressed, but also sort of that approach and understanding a little bit about when we see stress in others. And we want to mention that one of the best resources that we have is the Nebraska Rural Response Hotline. And so if anyone's really in a distressed situation, that's a really good place to go. They'll actually provide vouchers for folks to be able to receive some mental health counseling. And also we have a ruralwellness.unl.edu website that has a wealth of information in it as well. So again, I'm Glennis, and if you have any questions about any of this, please let us know. And I'll be glad to see quite a number of you this afternoon as we dig into the new budget calculator. Okay? Okay, so we're going to come back, I guess, 10:05. So join us, take a little break, and we'll see you then. Thank you.
Yeah, it's green light's on. Am I going? Okay, hi. We're back. Sorry for the technical delay. We're trying to get Austin hooked up via Zoom, and because he's going to be a part of this in a minute. And so we're doing the very best we can to get that going. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and get started. There we go. There we go. We have Austin on, so we'll get him in just a minute, and we'll get to him in his part. These are the topics we'll be talking about. It's on the slide right now. And know that that's how you reach me. I'm in East Campus in Philly Hall, and that's my phone number, my office phone number. And know that I have that office phone number set up so that it records a voicemail message if I'm not there, and I'm not there a lot. It'll record a voicemail message, come straight to my email, and I will reply to you. So that's how you do that. And Austin's last 4 digits are 1166, 782-1166. So that's how you get a hold of Austin. I'm going to talk about communications and succession. Austin will talk about negotiation. I'll come back and do a short section on lease provisions, and Austin's going to talk about how you should deal with a flood damaged or ground that's been not available for farming, and how you're going to put that back into place. So here's some stuff on lease communication. And by the way, this communication stuff goes for lease communications and farm succession communications, but the bottom line is, when something goes haywire, when we don't have a good lease in place, when somebody's mad at somebody, bad communication or no communication is about 90% of the problem. And I don't know exactly what that statistic is. I don't have a survey that talks about this, but I am telling you of the people that call me with a problem with their lease or a problem with their succession plan, and 90% of the time somebody's not communicating properly or not at all. So, and the unfortunate part is that in a lot of these land leases or a lot of the succession stuff, obviously all the succession stuff, you have to work with a family. So the bottom line is, when you're having that conversation about what's going on with a lease or what's going on with your succession plan, is your goal to still have a family when you get done? If it is, then don't say things that are going to cause problems. Just get the commitment that you're still going to have a family from the other side, the people that you're having a conflict with. Don't make that assumption. Get that commitment. Make sure the right people are involved, and get that family to start talking to each other. I know that's hard with some of the tough, silent types that don't want to talk about anything that relates to their business, but they still need to understand that they have to be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. So the big key with communication, if you're struggling with what to do with communication, just understand this. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. The key to communication is not talking. The key to communication is listening. And you listen by asking clarifying questions. What'd you do today? I laid pipe. Well, where'd you lay pipe at? And they say, what farm? And how did that go? And you have to talk about that. I mean, you keep asking more questions about what they were doing and what's going on, so they have to actually do more. And you ask questions, who and why and how, instead of just simple yes or no answer questions. Make sure they have more to say than just yes or no. And then if you need to, you repeat back to them what you've heard them say, so that you prove to the other party that you've heard what they're saying. Because at the end of the day, many times communication's improved if you show proper appreciation for the other person. Did I really hear what you said? Did I really appreciate what you're saying? If you feel appreciated and if you feel like you were heard, then you've established the beginning of good communications. Just remember that. Pay attention to what they're saying. Look at who's talking. Look at that person that's talking to you. Don't look down at your shoes. Don't look off into the sunset. Don't look at your iPhone or iPad or Android device. Do not talk. Let them talk. You have to ask clarifying questions. Ask follow-up questions. Did I hear you say that? And then you repeat what you think you heard them say. You follow directions if it's your turn to follow directions. And you don't think about what you're going to say. You visualize what they are saying so that you have a proper appreciation for what they've said. The biggest mistake people make when they're communicating with someone else is they're thinking about what their reply is going to be. Don't think about your reply. Think about what they've said, and make sure you stop and ask a follow-up question first. Did I understand you to say? Or I understand that you said this. Is that correct? Make sure you do that to show proper appreciation and shows you've listened properly. Then you have a chance. So keep that in mind. If you're a tenant, what do I communicate to my landlords? Even with crop share leases, yes, you probably should communication, or excuse me, not crop share, but even with cash leases, you should communicate properly. With crop share, obviously you're going to be communicating. For crop share leases and cash leases both, make sure you give timely crop updates, include moisture conditions, talk about the weed, disease, insect pressure, and considering sending that information if possible with text or text with pictures. I know of one landlord that was just incredibly pleased that his tenant sent him a text picture, a picture via cell phone, text picture of the corn after a hailstorm went through. So that landlord could see what was happening out there in real time and see how bad it looked, because that landlord was further away, couldn't make it there with a timely response or a timely manner. And so that landlord got to see how bad the crops looked, and that was incredibly important for both parties, because in that case, the picture was worth 1,000 words. So those are the kind of things the tenants should communicate. The landlord probably needs to be really clear with that tenant what they want to have, how they want to have that farm managed. If you'd ever tell them how do you want that farm managed, then how are they going to manage that asset properly? And specifically, if the farm, I have landlords that will call me up and say, I don't like the way this tenant's doing weed control. I don't like the way they're letting ditches go in my field. I don't like the way they're not cutting cedar trees. And I had one landlord call me up and say, I don't like the way they're mowing the road ditch. I said, did you tell them that? Well, no. Well, then whose fault is that? You have to tell them what your expectations are, and then that tenant can probably comply. Especially when you see things like in the lower left side of the screen where you see the weeds in that field there, or the disease pressure on that soybean plant in the lower right-hand sort of screen. You have to make sure that you communicate that you do or don't want things like that to happen and what your expectations are. What I'm finding more and more is, especially with cash leases, that the landlords feel like the tenant has all the power over the lease. And landlords say that to me because they feel like the tenant, because they're farming that ground, knows exactly where all the good spots are, where all the bad spots are, where all the weed pressure is, and they know all the information because they farmed. They're over that ground, they farm it, and they see what things look like. So they feel like the tenants know everything there is about that piece of ground, and so the landlords say that the tenant has all the control over the lease because they know what's good and what's bad and what's going on out there. And I'll have tenants, sometimes with the same landlord, in the same lease agreement, say that landlords have control over the lease, especially a cash lease. And they say, if I don't pay that landlord, the tenant will go, if I don't pay that landlord exactly what he wants by 10 o'clock this morning, he'll go to the coffee shop, and by 5 this afternoon have 3 other bids at that price or higher. So I feel like I'm over the barrel on what I pay for cash leasing. And so I don't think that this has to be a power struggle. I think that we have to have the lack of, we shouldn't be communications, we shouldn't have the feeling that somebody has more power than we do. It should be a shared decision-making tree, a shared process, and a good communication will help set that up. Because if you go to the final bullet point in the slide here, the first communication about a lease, especially for farm ground in eastern Nebraska, should not be about the price per acre. The first expectation should be, or the first communication about a lease should be, what skills does the tenant have, and what management skills does the landlord expect? In other words, if we can't match on a theoretical level on what's supposed to happen on that ground, how in the world are we going to ever come to a good lease agreement? Because the landlord will have an expectation that the tenant can't meet, and if that's not met, it doesn't make any difference what the price is per acre. Let's meet on the how we're going to manage the ground first, and then we'll figure out a price. As a matter of fact, if I have the right person farming my ground, my price doesn't have to be the top in the coffee shop. My price should be what I think is equitable for that person I'm renting to because of the skills they're going to bring and the work they're going to do for me to make that ground better. Because at the end of the day, when we're working with farmland and we're managing farmland, this is not about the price received per acre or the price paid per acre. This should be about how we're going to leave that land better for the next generation. At the end of the day, we don't get to take the land with us. When we're gone, the land stays where it's at. I've been to funerals. I've never seen it land in a casket. The land stays where it's at. So how are we going to make that land more productive for the next generation? How are we going to make that land more productive for the next set of mouths we have to feed? That should be our ultimate goal for the ground, or for the land purchase, or for the land that we own, the land that we're farming. And we should be so lucky to have that opportunity to leave that land in a better place for the next generation. And we should do everything we can to make sure that happens and not worry about the rental price. Do it based on what we want to have happen to that ground. Okay, a little bit on farm succession and transition. I'm going to do just a few minutes on this and understand that this is actually a part of a set of slides. Excuse me, my whole talk on land succession and transition goes on for about 2.5 hours, so understand that I'm just going to do a couple minutes out of here. So are we planning to retire as farmers? The interesting thing is, no, we're not. 35%, the top 2 categories in this slide, say that they're going to have some plans to retire, but if you look at the bottom 3 categories, 9 plus 24 plus 21, 54% don't ever plan to fully retire from farming. Really? You're not going to retire? And if you look at Iowa State's information, the state of Iowa's information, 31% never retire and 47% semi-retire. That's 78% never plan to get out of farming completely. And so what in the world's going on? The bottom line is farmers are not retiring or retiring in a way later age because they have a difficult time giving up control of the farm. Modern farm equipment, especially with GPS and automatic steering and stuff like that, allows them to farm longer. They relate their retirement to their own mentality. They don't want to think about death, so they're not going to think about retiring either. They can't afford to retire. That's the sad part. The good news is that they're having a healthier, longer life, so they don't have to retire quite as quick. I think just over half don't have a successor. I'm not real confident with the 55% number, but it's somewhat over half don't have a successor, so they might as well just keep farming until they can't. And then for a significant number of farmers, they also don't know what else they do. I didn't learn woodworking. I don't like to weld that much. I don't want to go to a coffee shop. I'm not going to the bar to play cards or drink all day. I would go to Huskers football, but no, this is right after the Minnesota game in the fall of 2020. So you understand why that's a bad idea, or that's not real appealing right now. And there's all kinds of things that are happening that make you think, well, hey, as long as I can crawl up in a cab, I might as well just keep going. Estate planning. Well, let me finish this up. But before I go on to the next slide, let me finish up by saying one thing. I'm not trying to give this presentation to get anybody to retire. You're not going to anyway, because you don't want to give up control. That's pretty clear. And so what I'm trying to tell you is someday you'll be done. Someday your life will end. We haven't figured out how to avoid that yet. We can avoid retirement, but we haven't figured out how to avoid the demise, the great demise. And so what happens to your stuff when you're gone? That's the point. And let's think about and have a plan for that now, because there's also the statistics show that most people don't have a good estate plan. Just over half don't have a good estate plan in place. And here's the problem. More often than not, planning tends to be deferred until some critical life event which occurs, which forces the family to address the matter. Somebody gets COVID, sick and dies. Somebody gets cancer, sick and dies. Somebody has a tractor accident, flip a tractor over themselves, they're gone. They have a car wreck, okay? There's any number of ways that we can have our demise, okay? And if you didn't do the planning, if you don't have your estate plan in place, and now you have this catastrophic event that occurred, critical life event, guess what? Your family then has to make the plans for you because you didn't do it. And guess what? The family's grieving your loss or grieving their loss. And are they going to make the best decisions when they're in grief and stress and all those things to go along with that? And so I would say, no, I don't think they will. And so let's get the planning done before there's that catastrophic or critical life event that forces the family to address the matter. Let's address the matter before that and get it done. We don't like to plan, or we don't want to do this because it's too complicated, we assume. And that's true. If you go talk to a lawyer, they're going to give you all kinds of information that, it's just overwhelming almost. We don't like to plan because it's mental work. I have to think about things I'm not used to thinking about, like probates and estates and wills and trusts and LLCs and how do they all work and what happens there and how do we do this. And We don't want to think about death. I already talked about that. And I'm also discovering we're afraid that if we do something, it'll be wrong at some point in the future. And guess what? It will be. If I do an estate plan now, in 5 years, chances are something changed in my family, or somebody died out of order, and that estate plan's not very good. So we are afraid something, because we know inherently that something will be wrong in the future with that estate plan that I put in place today. But I would submit this: if we have an estate plan in place, I can always change it. As long as I don't do an irrevocable trust, I can always change that estate plan. But if I don't have any plan at all, that could be a disaster. Because to change an estate plan is a few $100s, maybe $1,000 or so. If I don't have an estate plan in place at all and something screwed up, you're talking about tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars in mistakes versus just a few $100s to change a plan that you already have in place. So please do have a plan in place. There's 3 types of plans, or 3 things you need to think about as you get towards that end of that career. Actually, 3 things you probably should think about at any age, to be honest with you. Don't wait till you're 65 to do this. But you have to have end-of-life plans and those documents in place. Those end-of-life plans and documents include things like my health care power of attorney, my health care directive, and my durable power of attorney. Those are those end-of-life plans, documents that need to be in place. What happens when I'm on my deathbed or just gone? The second part of this is the estate plan, will, trust, other structures like that. What happens to my stuff? Where's that going to, how am I going to do my stuff? And the third part of it is if you're so lucky as there's somebody else joining you in a farming operation, what's my business succession plan going to be for them? In other words, I can distribute my assets through my will and my trust and my LLCs, those kind of things. But if I want to keep somebody going on with my place to the next generation, then I better think about what does that look like, and how am I going to arrange that with buy-sell agreements, long-term lease arrangements, how the machinery is going to get transferred, some of those things. And some of that can be done before death, quite honestly. But good communications need with all 3 of these so you get those done right. What I tend to find with people that don't have an estate plan is that they get into this circle of inaction. They just do nothing. Meaning, number 1, I should have a plan. Number 2, I go to a meeting or meet with a lawyer. Well, this doesn't even qualify for a meeting because, like I said, I'm only going a few minutes of a 2-hour talk. And number 3, this is complicated, it gives me a headache. So now I go to number 4, I take no action at this time because it's just too complicated. I don't want to think about it because I'm thinking about my death and that's not pleasant. So that's that circle of inaction. And people sit in number 4 for 3 months to 3 years. How do I know that? Happened to me too. I've been giving these talks for 10, 12 years now on estate planning, and I know that for the first 3 or 4 years, 5 years, I needed to update my estate plan, my will, if you will, my will. Because my original will, when I got with my wife when we were first married, it was the I love you will. Honey, if I'm gone, all my stuff goes to you. And hers will says, honey, if I'm gone, all my stuff comes to me. That's the I love you will. And it also covers that one important detail: who do we want to have take care of our children? Which aunt and uncle, or which grandpa and grandma, or which sister, or which brother? Who's going to take care of the kids if we're gone, both gone? That's that original early marriage will that everyone should have a place. So it's still important, do it. But then as you get later in life, your kids are gone, you got grandkids now, you got an estate, you have a house, you have land, you have stuff. Okay, what happens to that? And so that's the plan. That's when you need to update that plan. It's important to do that. So ideally, you want to try to get to some kind of sequential planning. I should have a plan, or hopefully not a catastrophic event. I go to a meeting and meet with a lawyer. My family meets to explore options. The people in charge pick the options, not the entire family. The people in charge pick the options. Options are picked, and that succession plan is developed, signed. Congratulations. Now, how long will I take to do this plan? Well, can I get it done in 3 days? Probably not. Can I get it done in 3 weeks? Probably not. Can I get it done in 3 months? Yeah, probably. 3 to 6 months is what you'd expect to have happen here, because you have to spend some time to get all the information pulled together that the lawyer will want, and then discuss it and think about what you want to do for sure and get that whole plan in place. Parents make all kinds of assumptions, and some of them are right, some of them don't turn out so well, and I want to talk about that for a second. I don't have to worry about doing an estate plan. My kids get along great right now. That'll continue even when I'm gone. That's a dangerous assumption. Don't assume that. Sometimes it's the money that motivates the kids after you're gone, so be careful about that. I know that my children want to keep this asset in the family even when we are gone. My wife and I are gone. Well, I wish I could tell you that was true. But to be honest, I had a lady call me up here a couple of years ago, and she said, it was exactly 2 years ago right now, and she said, I'm struggling. I said, I took my mom to the doctor about a month ago, and we went to the doctor's visit. On the way home from the doctor's visit, she said, go by the farm one last time, because Mom was living in a nursing home in town. Went by the farm one last time and just stopped, and Grandma looks out over the farm and says, this place has been a wonderful place for me for 65 years. It was just awesome. I loved it here. Promise me, daughter, no matter what, you'll keep the farm in the family. Daughter says, she's the executor of the estate. She's the oldest child. And so she says, yeah, Mom, we'll do what we can. We're going to do everything we can. So they go back, and as the luck would have it, the mom passes away about 2 weeks later in the nursing home. And now the kids are going to get together for the holidays, this oldest daughter and her middle-aged brother and the youngest daughter, three of them in the family. And they're discussing what should happen with the farm now at Christmas time. And the brother goes, yeah, I agree with Mom. Let's try and keep it in the family. We'll just take the rental income. We'll be great. None of them farmed. And little sister goes, oh, man, you know, I could really use the cash to kind of pay some bills and take care of some stuff that I've got going on right now. So I'm gonna have to bail on this thing. I know that's not what Mom wanted, but I'm gonna probably have to do what I got to do. And depending on how you own that ground, in this case they own it tenants in common, then little sister can force the sale of that ground, and none of them will be on the farm. And none of them will own that farm anymore. This was not what Mom wanted to have happen. Now the debate becomes, on situations like that, if that's what the parents want, maybe the parents need to plan that into the will. But more importantly, maybe the parents better be asking kids before they make their will, or maybe before they make their documents, do you want to own farm ground or not? Okay? I'll be gone. I don't care what happens. The kids will just have to figure out how to divide that. Well, if you want to start World War III, go ahead with that assumption. Since I have 4 children, my assets have to be divided 25% to each. That's equal, and that's the only fair way to do it. Well, let me tell you something. About 2.5 years ago, a farmer comes up to me and says, Allan, I want to talk to you for a second. I said, yeah, what's going on? Well, I'm one of 4 kids, this example right here. I've been on the farm with Mom and Dad for 50 years. None of the other kids, the other 3 are gone. The other 3 are off the farm, away. Now Dad's been gone, Mom passed away, and now we read the Mom's will last month, and Mom's will says it has to be divided 25, 25, 25, 25, just like it says on my slide. And I don't know how I'm going to stay in business, because I know that all my brothers and sisters, the other 3, are going to want to just rent the farm ground to me. I think some will want the money, and I think the guy was maybe 67 or 68 years old. He said, I can't get a 30-year loan now to pay off my brothers and sisters today. The bank's not going to loan that money to me at my age. So again, the parents have to maybe understand the concept that fair is not equal. Equal is not fair, okay? So just think about that for a second. And then someday, son or daughter, this will all be yours. If they don't have that sign notarized and with some documents supporting it, it's not true. So parents, if you're making some of these assumptions, great. If not, I just think that you're asking for trouble with your family after you're gone. So first conversation regarding any estate plan is when you're gone, are you going to have a family? Just like when I talked about at the beginning of the lease, at the beginning of this section with the leases. Don't make that assumption, get that commitment. And secondly, before you start talking about an estate plan with your kids, grandpa and grandma, mom, dad, whoever's in charge, have to be on the same page. If they're not, they better get on the same page before they're having conversations with kids, because if grandma comes out and says one thing and grandpa comes out and says another thing, then you're going to have the kids warring with each other before they're even dead. So just be careful about things like that. Be ready for that catastrophic event. Have an estate plan in place. Avoid that circle of inaction. Put your plan together. Have great communication with your family. Avoid those assumptions that aren't always correct. And to get my whole talk, it's on my website agecon.unl.edu/succession. That whole talk is there. One last thing. Sometime right after the beginning of the year, we're trying to work on a couple problems. One problem is young people interested in farming or interested in agriculture don't have good access to land. Their parents don't have land. The other problem is older producers with no apparent heirs want their operation to continue. I want to keep my cattle going as XYZ Ranch. So we're trying to figure out a way to make this all go together. The solution is to create a database for both to list their services, the young people or the land seekers to list their services looking interested in land, and the landowners saying, hey, I'm willing to work with somebody to try and get them some land. And watch for that on the farm.unl.edu website, farm.unl.edu website, because we're going to have that applications available shortly after the first of the year, and we'll be announcing it statewide. And the applications are reviewed, the matches for the land seekers are sent to landowners, and we'll get possible interviews put together. I think that, and so if you've got questions on that, make sure you contact me. I'll be glad to answer them. We're going to see how that goes. We've got to try it. I think it seems like the right thing to do. So now we're going to get Austin on, I think, with some work on negotiation. Thanks for your kind attention. No questions, correct? No questions. All right, not that we know of. All right, thank you. I'll be back in a minute.
Okay, Austin, you're on.
Okay, so hope everybody's doing all right. So my section here, we're going to start talking about negotiations. And so the first thing that I kind of want to bring up is, what does a traditional negotiation look like? If I were to talk to you and ask you, what a negotiation entails, more than likely you're probably going to first think of going to a car dealership, or maybe it's an implement dealership, and you walk in the door and you just sit down and you start going off on the guy, and you're going to tell him that tractor's not worth more than $40,000, and they're going to come back and say it's at least worth 90. And what you're going to do is you're going to walk into this tiered step where each person is going to reduce their offer little by little. They might threaten to walk out the door. They might say some things, but when it all comes down, basically you're splitting the difference in some sort of a compromise. So if we had that 40,000, we had that 90,000, splitting the difference somewhere in the middle, maybe we end up at $78,000. The problem is, in that entire conversation, we're not talking about things like, tractor horsepower or delivery dates or anything of substance. What we're talking about in that entire conversation is money. We're just negotiating over money at that point. And if we negotiate over money, what we end up doing, and I tried to demonstrate in this chart, the left-hand side is your satisfaction. The higher up you go on that x-axis, the higher your satisfaction is. My satisfaction or the other person's is that y-axis. And the further out we go on the y-axis, the more my satisfaction goes up. And what happens is we get stuck on that black curve. And when we look at that black curve, it's either I'm going to be really satisfied and you're going to be mad, or you're going to be extremely satisfied and I'm going to be mad. Or if we end up compromising, basically neither one of us are happy, but at least we're not happy together. If we get stuck on that line and we don't get off of this conversation of, what we're talking about cash rents today, if we don't get off of that dollar value, we're wasting a whole lot of potential out into the far right that we could be talking about and we could get covered. And so what I'm trying to do, and Al's going to touch base on it a little bit later, is we're trying to get you to think of things more than just talking about what the dollar amount is. We need to start talking about some additional things like soil quality, additional labor, and some parts like that. And when you're sitting there looking at it, what I'm trying to get you to do is switch from that initial graphic that I had where we had those tiered steps going back and forth and we were haggling. And what I want you to do is this. We're going to use communications and relationship, what Al just got done talking to you about. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about interests, options, and criteria. What's everybody interested in? Why are we talking about cash rent in the ground? What are the options? Maybe we need to talk about flex lease. Maybe we need to talk about, using some sort of a crop share or cash rent. What are the criteria? What exactly is a good deal going to look like? Do we need to set some standards in terms of looking at maybe the UNL studies or USDA surveys? Maybe we need to look at recent crop reports. We need to get some criteria, and basically it'll boil down to either what's called a BATNA or your best alternative negotiated agreement. If I don't come to an agreement with this person on this day, what am I going to do otherwise? If you're a landlord, if I don't agree to rent to farmer A, my best alternative is probably going to be renting it to farmer B. If I do decide to sign that agreement, I've got a commitment. Simple as that. But the idea of this is if we go through this process and we've got this set up, you should be able to bring your written agreement, or else if it's a verbal agreement, you should be able to verbally walk us through it. But you should be able to call and talk to either Al or me, and we should be able to come up with the same principled idea of the contract in terms of price and sustainability in years. We should be able to come up with all that information if you've done this process just by describing it to us. When I'm talking about areas of value creation, something more than just dollars, there's 5 areas that we can look at: resources and capabilities, relative valuations, forecasts, risk preferences, and time preferences. To give you a couple examples of this, what we've got is just a couple of them that I threw out from the top of my head that somebody might throw out and offer when they're doing a cash rent negotiation. And so, for instance, when we're looking at resources and capabilities, if I'm a farmer and right now I've got 30,000 bushels of grain that I'm taking to the elevator and storing every year for 5 months, 30,000 bushels times 5 cents a month times 5 months, I'm paying the elevator $7,500 to store that grain. If there's an 80-acre farm that comes up for rent that has 30,000 bushels of storage on it, who would I rather pay that $7,500 to? Would I rather pay it to the elevator, or would I rather pay it to secure 80 more acres that has storage on it? I'm probably going to go ahead and try and flip that money from the elevator over to that cash rent negotiation. If I was taking the whole amount to it, $7,500 divided by 80, I'm boosting my cash rent offer from whatever I was at up $93 an acre. So some of this stuff can amount to big money. Some of the other ideas that I commonly see when I'm looking at some of the contracts that people share with me, a lot of people start talking about mowing the lawns, mowing greater ditches, maintaining waterways. I have seen a couple of instances lately where I'm starting to see a little bit more in flex leases, which is a forecasting risk preference. Maybe I want to set a base cash rent and then have it adjust or flex according to what the market and the yields are doing. So there's a lot of things that we can do in here that we can help boost what the value is of the negotiated contract we're working with. We already talked about BADNA. BADNAs can be good and BADNAs can be bad. For instance, a landlord talking from farmer A and turning them down to go to talk to farmer B, more likely that can be a good thing. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The other thing, though, and this is kind of where I want to stress, is when we start talking about ZOPA, which is a zone of possible agreements, when you look at that little graphic there, I've got the seller's range, which is their desired price versus their walkaway point, when they're just going to say, I don't want to sign this deal. I'm going to walk away and not do it, versus the buyer's desired price versus their walkaway point. When you have a point that overlaps, that's your zone of possible agreement. So if my walkaway was 50 and your walkaway was 60, the difference between $50 and $60, that $10 there, is that zone of possible agreements, and that's probably where we're going to end up. What tends to happen is, though, when we're talking about cash rent and some of the beginning farmers that I talk to, when you start looking at what those prices are, you're not getting a zone of possible agreements if you're doing strictly just cash rent. If all you're doing is talking about how much you can afford dollars per acre based on the acres themselves, you've got, $20, $30 an acre gaps compared to what some of the other guys are offering. And so I'm trying to get you to a point where you can find created value that might not be monetary, but might be focused more on whether it's risk preference or labor or resources. We're trying to close that gap so that agreements that weren't possible before are something you can get done. What is a good outcome? And this is another one that I commonly see that I think is misinterpreted. Good outcomes are not, I got the most money. It's just not. It needs to be better than alternative, because if I've got an alternative that's out there and it's better than what my current contract is, I should have taken the alternative. But a good outcome to me is the best of many options and is supported by criteria. And it's got clear communication built into it. There's some other points in there, but the fact of the matter is, if we've really talked about this and gone through it, and we've set criteria that helps us gauge and manage this beast, and we're sitting down and we're talking a couple of times a year and discussing what's going on, we're going to have a good outcome from this contract. And more than likely, we're probably going to get a continued cash rent or work with this person again. Originally, when I made this slide, which is be an investigative negotiator, I thought I had everything covered, but last week I sat down with a landlord who was first year ever going to cash rent out their ground. They wanted somebody there to witness the letter opening for the cash rent bids. And I started seeing some of the things that I've been talking about and Al's been talking about in terms of trying to create value. The problem is I think we were, from the contracts that I saw, there was a little bit not painting a picture. And so really I need to change this slide probably, that you need to be an investigative negotiator that's an artist. So I do need to just not ask what, but ask why. It's not what's it going to take to cash rent this, but why are you cash renting it? Trying to find what those underlying values are and what you're actually seeking. Don't interpret demands as opportunities. Don't dismiss anything as their problem. The last one is extremely important. This isn't talking to Woodhouse. We're not going and we're selling and we're never going to see this person again once that truck leaves the lot. In terms of cash rent agreements, more than likely you're going to be working with this person every year. And so we definitely want to make sure that we're getting this covered. The artist part of this, the thing that I need to add to this is think of TV infomercials. When you see some, as seen on TV commercial, and they start talking to you about all the great things their product does, and then they start doing the added value stuff, we're going to provide free shipping. We're going to provide buy one, get one. The thing that they do is they go ahead and put a value to that piece. And that's something that I was seeing was missing in a lot of the bids that I was seeing coming across the desk. Somebody might put on a bid that, I'm going to offer a flex lease, and it's a great opportunity for the landlord. Why is it a great opportunity? We need to be able to paint a picture as to what exactly some of these things are going to do for us. So if I'm interested in renting grain bins, I need to put out the math and show that there's $93 of value that's getting added because of the grain bins. If I'm doing a flex lease, I need to put in a chart that demonstrates what exactly is going to happen according to what days. Because for the person I was working with last week, and for a lot of people, there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of things on their mind, and they tend not to be experts in everything. They don't know about the beginning farmer programs and the tax incentives that go along with it. They don't know a lot of these things that's creating value and renting to that person. And so you need to help paint the picture and demonstrate to them why that stuff is important. The last thing that I kind of want to point out here is commitment. If you're talking about a cash rent agreement, and I talked to the landlord last week, and this is what we agreed to do, it's not a one and done thing. I'm not going to meet with somebody, sit down with them, and hammer this out in a day. My expectations for a first meeting when we're sitting down talking about any sort of negotiated agreement is we need to sit down and figure out what the interest and criteria are, and then we're going to leave and gather information. So the first commitment you're ever going to make is who's going to find what information we need to set the criteria, and what day next week we're going to meet again. It's on that second day, or maybe even the third day, that you're going to get to the point where you either say, no, this deal isn't for me, or yes, I want to go ahead and sign that contract. If you're sitting down in an hour and hammering out some sort of contract with a brand new tenant, I got to tell you, I'm kind of questioning whether or not that's going to be a good, strong agreement or not. Sometimes it works out and sometimes it don't. But if you sit down and you do the legwork at the beginning, I think you're going to find that you've got better contracts and better agreements going forward, to the point where you're not worried about whether or not that tenant's going to be a good fit for your operation. So we'll switch it back over to Al, and we'll have Al talk about some of the lease provisions we'd like to see in some of these agreements. Actually, we are going to switch over, and we're going to do adjusting leases, and we'll get caught back up with Al here in a second. In terms of adjusting leases, and this was in response to some of the flood damages we saw a couple of years ago when we had all the ice dams. A lot of contracts were having some issues, and we were getting a lot of phone calls stating, well, what exactly is my responsibility when we've got damaged ground, or the farmer can't get into farm? What exactly is my responsibility? What's the tenant's responsibility? And how do we divvy this up? And so what we did at UNL, and Al and Jim were key influencers on this, is we kind of split it up into heavy work and hard work. And so when we're talking about the hard work, primarily this is going to be a landlord expense. And what I'm talking about here is removing branches and corn stalks, trash debris. If you've got an ice storm, more than likely, if you've got a fence row full of trees, you're probably going to have to go out and pick up sticks. You'll have some trees down, you'll have sticks down, so that needs to be removed. So it's a landlord expense. It's just a lot of hand labor in terms of light equipment. Maybe you need a four-wheeler and a chainsaw. But who typically ends up doing this type of work? My comment would be the tenant typically ends up doing this kind of work. If it's anything typical of kind of what I pitch and the contracts that I see, for a lot of tenants, I would put a dollar limit to some of this stuff. And so if I can get a project done for under $400, I'm just going to take care of it as a tenant. It's peace of mind for the landlord. They don't have to worry about it. Ice storm, windstorm comes through, knocks down a bunch of trees. I can get it done for $400. I'll just go in and handle it, and you don't have to worry about it. It's a landlord expense, but we need to demonstrate the value and explain what it is that we're offering to do. When we start talking about heavy work, this is like bringing in dozers and excavators. We've got gullies and ruts and sandbars, and we need to go through and fix this. Again, it's a landlord expense, and this is something the landlord probably needs to bear responsibility for, and the tenant's probably not going to take care of it. If they're setting the dollar limit to it, my comment would be the tenant's probably going to call you and say, we need to go out and look at the farm. There's been, a windstorm or the ice storm had an issue, and we need to talk about some stuff. If it was my operation, I'd haul them out there and I'd say, this is more than I can get done for $400. I'm thinking it's probably going to be somewhere in the range of $1,700 for me to bring in a dozer and do it myself. Here's a couple of contractors in the area that also do this kind of work if you would like to go out for bids, and just let me know how you want to proceed. So we're giving them options, we're being clear, and we're communicating. Specifically dealing with sand. When you've got sand, you basically have three options. My first one and my favorite one is, from the river it came, from the river it shall return. But there's a little bit of stipulations to that onto how it works. If you're wanting to push sand back into the river, you need to get a permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And basically they're going to tell you how much sand per day that you can push back in there. If you find out the sand that you have is contaminated, you're going to have to dispose of it somehow. And so that means you're going to have to get a front end loader and a dump truck, and you're going to have to haul it off to the waste, and it's going to be expensive. There are some situations where you can reuse it. For those of you that live close to a metropolitan area, a lot of building firms and county offices will buy sand for projects. My comment when you start looking at that type of thing is your contractual obligation is to provide the farm and a ready use for the purpose it was rented. And so if I've got a bunch of sand on there and I don't want to clear it off for the tenant because I want to sell it, more than likely I'm going to have to void that contract for the year. I won't get any cash rent because I'm using it for a different purpose, and the farmer or the tenant doesn't have access to the way that the contract is stated. What are provisions are built into current leases? We broke this down into crop shares versus cash rent. For those that are doing crop shares, this is about as easy as you can get. You've already decided on what your share production risks are. Maybe you're 60-40, maybe you're 50-50. You don't have to adjust the lease because you're already sharing in that risk. And so if it's 50-50, 50% of the cleanup is ending up on my desk. If you're cash rent, landlords typically expect their full lease payment. But if you can't get the ground in a usable state for the tenant, you're probably going to have a contractual law issue that you're going to have to look into, which is why we ended up seeing a lot of these phone calls about adjusting leases down to cover this. Just because there is a disaster, maybe it was the flood that we had, it doesn't mean the tenants are completely out. There are things like prevent plant, equip, emergency conservation programs that are help funding and keeping them afloat. But a lot of those payments are geared towards the supplies that they purchase that were going to go into the ground. And so maybe the flood happened before plant. Well, they've got a bunch of seed and stuff that they've got to return, and they may or not be able to get it returned for the full amount. Maybe they already did plant and wiped it out. And so now they've got a bunch of lost crop. It's not that they're completely out of the money, but it's not like they're going to be making a profit off this. A lot of the insurance programs are more or less built to try and get you back to break even or a little above, but it's not necessarily meant to provide to cover that cash rent amount. In terms of costs and considerations, if you've got issues with gullies or ruts, or you've got things that you're thinking about doing on your farm to try and improve the water quality or erosion factors, there are sources out there for funding. NRCS, which is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, has 3 main sources of funding available, as well as the Natural Resource Districts, the NRDs, have cost share programs. If you'd like to watch a video, and again, this is one of those 1.5 hour long presentations that are outside the scope of what we're going to be talking about today, we do have a video with NRCS available. The link down there below at farm.unl.edu has that video available for you to watch. To try and give you an idea of what some of this stuff is going to cost, when you're looking at dozers and excavators, you're talking about $160 per hour. That does not cover any of the additional factors such as culverts and risers and tiles that you might have to put in order to finish a job. This stuff is tax deductible, but you're limited to 25% of your gross farm income in any one year. To give you some more ballpark numbers, if you're in eastern Nebraska and you want to do a tile and terrace job on your farm, take your acres times $700, and that'll give you an estimate of how much that project's going to cost. And so, for example, if I had an 80-acre farm, rough rule of thumb number, it's probably going to be around $56,000 in order to get that project done. I've got some more numbers on the chart for you. But what I'm trying to pitch, and we'll go back to that for a second, what I'm trying to pitch on this is, if you're a landlord and you're getting in cash rent, something I would highly recommend that you need to build into your budgeting plan is you need to be setting aside money for some of this stuff. And so if I'm getting $230 an acre cash rent every year, maybe I need to be taking $30 an acre and putting it into a slush fund or a savings fund, so that when a disaster happens, when terraces break down and I need to repair them, I've got that kind of money, because $56,000 in one shot out of the blue is going to be a lot for somebody to handle. And so we need to kind of be prepared for this stuff and have money sitting waiting for when this happens. One other consideration that popped up is the year that we ran into when you start talking about doing cost share projects. A lot of the cost share stuff ends up being late July, early August. And while that is fantastic for the landlord to be able to get assistance to do some of these expensive projects like that tile and terrace work, when you start having a project that has to be done in late July, early August, the traditional corn and soybean rotation is not going to work, because you can't get that crop planted and out of there that amount of time. And so now we're talking about forcing a different type of commodity to be grown by the tenant. And so the question that came up that we had was, if I have to tell the tenant to plant wheat instead of soybeans, do I need to adjust my cash rent? Well, based on the contract, my comment was yes. More than likely, whether it's a handshake lease or a written lease, I haven't seen very many leases in there that give the landlord the right to designate what crop the tenant grows in a given year. They might set limits and say you can't plant milo because I don't want to deal with shatter cane, but they don't say that year 1 is going to be corn, year 2 is going to be soybeans, year 3 is going to be wheat. That's generally something that's a right given to the tenant. And so when we look at this chart down below, what we end up seeing is I just ran a 3-year revenue of what the expectation is of a corn soybean rotation versus a corn wheat rotation. And what we're looking at is somewhere in the ballpark of a $200 per acre difference between doing the soybeans versus the wheat. And so there is going to be an effect to the tenant. And so the question was, if I do need to issue a bit of a relief to the tenant for having the wheat on the year instead of the soybean. What exactly do I need to reduce the cash rent by? Typically, when we look at cash rents, they run somewhere between 26 and 30% of projected revenue based on corn. And so if I had a 230 bushel an acre corn crop for a particular field and corn prices are $3.90, that's $897 per acre revenue. Take that times 28%. And so another one of those rule of thumb ballpark estimates on bid and cash rent ground, $250 an acre cash rent rounded down is probably somewhere in the ballpark of what I'm going to see that rent for. And so if I use that logic and apply it to the wheat and the soybean, what I did is I just created this chart down below. And so we've got soybeans projected revenue based on 65 bushel an acre and $10 soybeans. Wheat's at 80 bushel per acre with 540. And so we get the projected revenues of 650 and 432. And then I just created tiers. And what I'm doing is I'm just trying to get a stepping stone to start the conversation. Again, none of this stuff is set in stone. There is no golden rule as to how to adjust rent down based on disasters or cost share agreements that require a certain crop be planted. And so what we need to do is we need to set up a guideline or a way that we can go into the conversation and have it. And so with this, we said, well, if it's 30% of revenue, that would be $195 on soybeans, $130 on wheat. And so there's a $65 difference. And so I need to reduce cash rent somewhere in the place of $65 if we thought 30% of revenue was right. Maybe we think 27% of revenue is right. In that case, it would be a $59 reduction. Again, this is just a conversation. We're just trying to get it going in terms of trying to find what that sweet spot is through communication and keeping our relationship intact. If you do have questions in terms of adapting your lease and you want to tie it to production, I had mentioned this a little bit earlier with those flexible cash leases. We have information on that link that will guide you and help you understand how a flexible cash lease works and how you might demonstrate and show that to a landlord. And also, I would 100% consider adding into an agreement whose responsibility it is to cover certain damages. And I would probably highlight that dollar limit one. The dollar limit one's pretty simple, and I think it's going to cover a lot of issues for you in terms of making things clear and keeping the ball rolling in terms of an operation. And so with that, what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and switch back to Al, and we'll have Al talk about some of the lease provision agreements that need to be included in cash lease in UNL's perspective and what the thought process is behind that.
Am I going? I'll go. All right, thanks. Thanks, Austin. Glad to be back. I've got a very short segment to finish up on, and it's some stuff on lease provisions that I wanted to try and get covered. And this won't take very long. Make sure if you have any questions to type them in the chat. I'll be glad to answer them, or send me an email or give me a voicemail. I'll be glad to help you on that too. Anything you want going forward, we'll be glad to help with. So lease provision management. Jim, you want to give me my slide with my mug shot so we can, in a corner so we can. You're right. Okay. Wrong computer. There we go. Now we got it. Now we're all set now. Perfect. All right, so some stuff on lease provisions. So again, Jim said it, I'll say it too. Please have all your leases in writing. If you have a verbal lease, get that in writing. Please change that out, end that, get that in writing. Not that you don't want to change tenants or change landlords. Just have a written lease. Verbal leases have to be terminated by September 1st for the following year. So in other words, most leases start, especially handshake or verbal agreements start on March 1st, like of 2021. They needed to be legally ended by September 1st of 2020. However, if I'm a landlord and I want to go to a written lease, I could probably go to my tenant and say, hey, we're going to start a written lease for this next year. Please go along with me on that. And they probably would agree. So you can still probably get one written if you don't have one. It's not the same for Pasture. Pasture assumes a 5-month lease typically. That's usually May through October or June through November. 5 months, and so since the lease ends, there's no verbal lease termination notice have to be given because that lease ended. The lease ended by November 1st this last year. You have to start a new lease next May or June. So just know that you have to get the pasture leases, unless they're written, unless there's specific provisions in that writing, there's no way to, you can't deal with that very well unless it's, and some pasture leases are continuous leases too. So just be aware of what's written in the pasture lease. Things to have in your written lease include things like when's your lease is going to start, when the lease is going to end, when's your lease termination going to be. Is it going to be 6 months like the verbal agreements, the handshake agreements? I think it's a good idea. I think most leases start March 1st, and so 6 months before that is September 1st the previous year. I like that because in the fall is when farmers usually buy their inputs for the following year. Get their diesel fuel purchased, get their seed purchased, get their fertilizer purchased. All those things happen in the fall typically. A lot of them in December, quite honestly. And so if you give them notice by the time they're starting to make those decisions for the next year, you're not sticking them with a bunch of inputs that they can't use because they don't have your farm to farm. So please be considerate of that. Also think about how much notice you're going to give them on termination. Again, I just talked about that. Holdover clauses, in other words, how are you going to set it up that the lease would just continue from year to year to year? And when are you going to renegotiate that lease for the next term? In some cases, everybody wants stuff renegotiated by September 1st. Some people want everything renegotiated by March 1st. I don't have a textbook. I don't have a research study telling me how to have you do it. I know some people that have their leases renegotiated in November before Thanksgiving for the next year, so they can go to Arizona or California or Texas for the wintertime, and so they want to at least renegotiate before they go south. So just have those conversations ahead of time. And the reason I want you to have that conversation about when you're going to renegotiate the lease is just simple. On years where you have high prices, all the landlords want to have their leases renegotiated right away because, and all the tenants won't because the tenants are going to hope that the prices drop. On years where you have low prices, all the tenants want to renegotiate right away, and all the landlords want to wait for the prices to go back up again. So if you set a date, then you don't have those games being played. That's why I recommend that. Some things on fertility. Okay. The main two things I worry about here is phosphorus and lime. And so, okay, just to back up a second, fertility, nitrogen has to be addressed, and especially for corn. And we don't worry about nitrogen in terms of holdover because it really doesn't hold over. So you're going to put on nitrogen every time you need it. You don't need it for soybeans, but you probably need it for corn. Phosphorus does hold over in the ground, and actually farmers have been known to mine or take the phosphorus out of the soil, especially when you have a high cash rent. I've got a high cash rent to make my cash flow work. I can't afford to put any phosphorus out there, so you just mine what's there. So you make sure you protect the landlord to make sure they're not the tenant isn't mining the phosphorus out of the soil. But if the tenant puts a bunch of phosphorus out there, that phosphorus is going to last 2, 3, 4, 5 years in that soil in good shape. And if the tenant puts a load of phosphorus out there, it's going to last 2 or 3 years, and the lease terminates, then you should be protecting the tenant too, because he should get some reimbursement for that phosphorus he put out there. Now, lime should be a landlord expense, period. End of the sentence, end of the story, done. However, I know of some leases where the tenant's been applying that. Again, lime is going to be much like phosphorus into the last several years. Actually, lime, eastern Nebraska, Lancaster, Saline County, where I grew up, those places will last 10 or 15 years typically, maybe 20. And so if the tenant's applying that lime, they should be protected with a clause in lease that says if I put out 30 acres of $30 per acre on lime, and I'm off of there in 3 years, I should get 90% of that lime cost back because I'm only used 10% of the lime. So just some things to think about for that lease. However, I would recommend that the lime be applied by the landlord in all circumstances because it's a long-term landlord expense for the improvement of the soil for that tenant. Okay. Fixing excessive erosion should be a landlord's expense. However, in some cases, the tenant has the equipment, they just go out there and take care of it. The landlord should take that consideration when they're setting the rent. Non-crop acres. Controlling cedar trees and noxious weeds is technically a landlord expense. However, some tenants will take care of that. Again, the tenant should take that in consideration, be willing to pay for the services or whatever has to be done, or give a break on the rent, make the rent cheaper. If the landlord wants the ground to be tilled versus no-till, they need to make sure their tenant knows that. However, most tenants have moved to no-till, especially with higher priced diesel fuel than we had 30 years ago, 40 years ago. That's a conversation that has to be had before the lease starts. Although no-till is kind of taking over the world, and appropriately so. Organic versus non-organic production, that flies in the face of the tillage versus no-till. If I'm organic, that means I can't put spray on, which means I'm probably tilling. If I'm non-organic, then I can probably go no-till because I'm spraying for weeds. So make sure that you don't ask somebody to do no-till and organic, because those two won't mix very well, because how are you going to control the weeds if you're not tilling? Just think about that. GMO versus non-GMO, you can ask a farmer to go non-GMO. In some cases, contracts are available, but quite honestly, the GMO horse is out of the gate. There's 92% of the corn, 97% of the beans are GMO products. I mean, those aren't exact numbers, but it's close to that. And so that's already done. We're using GMO products. And then corn stock residue, crop residue removal, especially corn stalks. Grazing, don't get excited about that. Let somebody graze. Pick up the volunteer corn. Makes it easier to control weeds in the soybeans the next year, especially the volunteer corn. Pick up the corn ears. Baling stocks, however, especially if you go out there and shred and rake everything up and bale it all up into corn stalk bales, I'm okay with it once in every few years, every 4, 6 years, 8 years. But boy, don't do it every year you have corn on that field, because it's just too hard on organic matter and too hard on the phosphorus. So I just tried to roll through these as quick as I could. Other items for lease provisions on pasture. Make sure you have a clear definition of who's taking care of fencing. In a typical pasture situation in Nebraska, the tenant does the fencing, the landlord buys the supplies, wire and posts. Also, on pasture leases, make sure that your lease accounts for the big three. For me, the big three are what happens if you have a fire, what happens if there's a drought, there's no hay or grass, and what happens if your grass gets hailed out. Have those conversations before the lease starts, and even put provisions in the lease that says how you're going to deal with those. That's the only way to handle it properly. So if you have a big drought like we did in 12, that you can appropriately deal with that in a clear way, because it's already been defined. Also, on hunting rights. Hunting rights on cash leases, the hunting rights go with the tenant. On pasture leases, the hunting rights stay with the landlord, because that 5-month rule. The pasture leases ended before the hunting season starts. And just know that for hunting rights, you need to have good liability insurance on that asset that you own if you're the landowner. So if somebody goes out there and hunts and they get hurt, they don't come back, that you have a liability protection to help you. Now, the recreational use law that got put in place 5, 6 years ago basically says this: if I allow Jim, for instance, he was our first presenter, to go hunt on my ground, he gets hurt out there, falls into a hole, turns an ankle or something. If I allow him to go hunt and I didn't charge him anything, he's on his own. It's his liability. That's what the recreational use law says. And it not only applies to hunting, but it applies to horseback riding, ATVs, side-by-sides, so, any kind of recreational use out there, including fishing, that sort of thing. However, if I charge Jim to go hunting on my farm, then I have to be careful. I have to have additional insurance saying that I'm covering that recreational use of my farm because I took money for it. So just visit with insurance people about that, or call me up and we'll talk about it some more. Or you call Dave Aiken up in our department. He's the lawyer that can help with that law and explaining it better. And then this is Austin's part. He's already been through this already. And I think we are, wait a minute, there's our last slide. There's our contact information again to get a hold of me. I'm on the left side of the slide. Austin's on the right-hand side of the slide. Know that if you registered for this and gave name, address, those kind of things, you will get a printed handout for today in the mail with all the slides, including the stuff that we did not cover. Jim especially didn't cover some of his stuff. And know that you'll be getting that. And know that you can contact any of the speakers. The speaker information will be in all the slides and that sort of thing. A little bit longer than we planned to be, but we're doing our best. And so this will be recorded. It'll be on the same YouTube link in the recording, at the Lancaster County site or at the farm.unl.edu site. Look either place for additional information. And know that this email address for me on this screen is wrong. It should be AVYH. I'm missing a letter, the Y. And go back to the first slide of my deck and you'll see it spelled correctly. And thank you for listening in, and thanks for being with us today. We appreciate it very much. Any questions?
No.
No questions.
Thank you, great presentation.
Thank you. Considering there's, and thanks to Karen and thanks to Jim. We appreciate those folks here at Lancaster County for supporting this today. It was a great day. Oh, here he put the slide up with the correct spelling. Thanks. No, my VYHNALK. Oh, VY. Oh, that's in there. Well, oh no. My name is spelled right at the top. Use that same last name spelling in the email address. There you go. All right. Thanks. I'm going to quit. Have a great day. We appreciate you being here.